Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday. How was how was your weekend? Good?
Not bad.
Not bad? Do anything fun, anybody? Yeah? What'd you do? You did what? Okay. Cool. Cool. Regina, what'd you do?
I played TS Flag with my brother,
Okay. That was fun.
and I watched F1 season,
You watched the new season of what?
Formula One.
Oh, Formula One. Okay. Is it good?
Um, yeah, the start of the new season.
Okay. We watched. We were looking for a new show to watch, so we watched the first episode of a show on Netflix called Manifest. Have you seen it come up?
The plating thing.
Yeah. Have you watched any of it?
I watched it with my sister.
The whole thing? You watched the whole thing? Was it good?
It's okay, but it's not really to my liking.
Yeah. We had we had a little trouble with it too. We watched the first episode and we were like, I don't know.
Yeah, my sister loves it.
Does she? Okay. I think we might find another one. I don't think we're gonna keep going with that. Okay. So here we go. We had a little bit of interruptions last week. Of course, I was out sick, and then we were talking about the presentation a little bit. We'll come back and talk about the presentation a bit more, but I just want to get us back into history for, at least a day or so. So when we left off, we were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So we know that Cuba has a communist revolution, right, under Fidel Castro. He takes control of the government. Khrushchev and the Soviet Union are only too happy to recognize this new communist ally right in the backyard of the United States, right? What could be better than that? But of course, the Americans are a little bit apprehensive, right? They don't really want a communist country living right next door to them. They actually try to overthrow Castro's government, right? They send in a bunch of operatives to try to overthrow him. It doesn't work. The whole operation is a fiasco. It happens at a place called the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. And so there's an attempted invasion at the Bay of Pigs. It doesn't work. They never really get off the beach. They're defeated, and so it's very embarrassing. But anyway, we know that Khrushchev makes a deal with Castro to put some nuclear launching missiles on Cuba, right? And the Americans find out with one of their spy planes. This is one of the images that the spy plane produces. And so they have to do something about this, right? Unless they want nuclear weapons in Cuba pointed at the United States, they have to do something quick, right? And so there's some discussion, but they arrive at an attempt to quarantine, although that's a word we've heard too much of recently, but they're going to quarantine Cuba with their military ships and keep the Soviet Union from delivering nuclear missiles. But for this whole period, for this 5-day period or whatever it is, things are really, really tense, right? Because again, we've got two sides kind of coming closer to each other, and we're not really sure what's going to happen, right? Are the Soviets going to stop and turn around and go home? Are they going to keep going? If they keep going, should the Americans shoot at them? If the Americans shoot at them, is that a declaration of war? What if the Soviet Union opens fire on the Americans first? Then what? Nobody's really sure what's going to happen, right? And there's lots of submarines with nuclear weapons swimming around. There are nuclear bombers in the air with nuclear weapons ready to be sent to different targets. Everything is really tense, right? And so kind of a miscalculation on either side might result in catastrophe, right? So I said the book doesn't really do a good job of communicating that, but really anything could happen here, right? But fortunately, we learned that a deal is worked out, right? And so kind of behind the scenes, the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin and Robert Kennedy, who is the Secretary of State, they sit down at a table and say, okay, how can we settle this, right? And they come up with a deal where the Americans agree not to invade Cuba. They're going to remove their missiles from Turkey, and the Soviet Union will not put missiles into Cuba, right? And so we said that after this was all kind of resolved, there were some lessons learned, right? We saw that those two sides talking to each other was key, right? As is often the case, sadly, the United Nations is useless in a situation like this, right? This is a security issue. The Security Council might be able to decide on something, but both of these countries have veto power, right? So neither side can get really anything passed by the United Nations Security Council. So the UN couldn't really do anything. They just stood by and watched it all happen, right? There was value to diplomacy, right? This situation didn't get resolved with weapons. It got resolved by talking it out, right? And providing ways for both sides to step back while saving face, right? And we said that when you save face, you kind of preserve your honor, right? You preserve your dignity. And so both sides were able to step back. Neither one really looked like the loser. Everybody got something out of it, right? And again, I don't think the Communist Party of the Soviet Union really felt that way, but I think for most of the world, they felt like everybody stepped back. Nobody looked like the weak leader, right? We also saw that the Americans decided that they were going to strengthen their commitment to NATO and to West Germany, right? Because again, they realized that they might have to stand up to the Soviets with greater force, right? With greater military force. Again, other things to come out of this crisis, the idea that the world was kind of vulnerable to disaster here, right? Things came really close to a big problem, right? What if somebody decided to go rogue and just started firing, right? What if an American battleship just decided, we're just going to start shooting at the Soviets if they get too close, right? And then we could have had a massive disaster on our hands, right? And so I think both sides kind of realized that, wow, we've got to be careful, right? We've been pushing each other. We've been kind of egging each other on, but we really don't want to go over the edge, right? We really don't want to push one side too far and have things literally blow up in our face, right? So we see that these sides start to talk to each other more, right? We see that there's a hotline established between the White House and the Kremlin. So again, you can pick up, and honestly, I think it was a red colored phone, believe it or not. You pick up the red, if you've ever seen the old 1960s Batman, Commissioner Gordon had a phone that he could call Batman on that was like that too. It was like this bat phone. The 1960s Batman is really corny, it's really goofy, but anyway, he could pick up the phone and call Batman. And here, it's kind of the same thing. They can pick up the phone and talk to each other directly, right? And that's a big improvement, right? Also, we see the beginning of Non-Proliferation Treaties. So the two sides realize that, holy cow, this technology is super dangerous, and maybe we shouldn't spread it around, right? Maybe we shouldn't give it to other countries. And so countries start to sign on to Non-Proliferation Treaties saying that if they have nuclear capacity, that they won't give it to anyone else. And some countries that actually don't have it agree not to develop it in the first place, right? So Canada is one of those. Canada signed on to Non-Proliferation Treaties, and we said we're not going to develop nuclear weapons. And we haven't. We don't have any. Hopefully hopefully the United States will defend us, but we don't have any of those. So we also said in another section of the text, what's his name? Khrushchev stepped down, right? The Communist Party thought that he had kind of failed, right? He hadn't improved Soviet agriculture. They didn't really like the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They thought Khrushchev should have been tougher, right? And they felt that he wasn't. He put up the Berlin Wall, right? Because he couldn't convince the Western powers to get out of Berlin. And so they kind of felt he was a failure, right? He wasn't really doing the job, and so he should step down. And so he does, and they replace him with Leonid Brezhnev, right? Brezhnev, of course, has to deal with the exact same problems that all Soviet leaders have to deal with. Soviet agriculture and Soviet economy, how to improve relationships with the West, and how to control the Soviet bloc, right? Those Eastern European, Eastern Bloc countries, right? Pretty quickly, Brezhnev has a little, I'll get to that in a second. Pardon me. We said that the Soviet economy is not great at this period, right? They're dumping massive amounts of money into their military and their nuclear weapons program to stay the same as the United States. But the United States is a much richer country, right? And so the United States is able to fund a massive military while still keeping a really good quality of living for their citizens. The Soviet Union, not so much, right? They're kind of living a quality of life that's about 50 years behind the United States, right? So people are kind of struggling, right, in the Soviet Union, and it's because they're paying for this massive military and massive weapons campaign. So Brezhnev has a challenge right away in Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovakian Communist Party make Alexander Dubček the leader of their Communist Party, and Alexander Dubček's got a lot of new ideas that he wants to put in place, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to leave the country, freedom to assemble and to set up organizations that are not the Communist Party, the ability for non-communists to hold government positions, and all of these are brand new freedoms, right? Nobody has these freedoms in the Soviet bloc. So Alexander Dubček proposes them, but before they can be approved, before they can be put into place, in rolls the Red Army, right? And so clearly this is too much freedom for the Soviet bloc. Brezhnev rolls in, squashes the rebellion. It's not really a rebellion. Rounds up the political leaders like Alexander Dubček, throws them in jail, and establishes a kind of hardline communist government to replace him, right? So again, just like we saw in Hungary, too much freedom, or even the suggestion of more freedom, results in invasion and control, right? And from this, I don't know if I have a slide on it. Yeah. From this comes this Brezhnev Doctrine, right? Do you remember the Truman Doctrine? Do you remember what it said? What was the Truman Doctrine? What did it say? Just in our own words. Right. That's pretty good. So Harry Truman, back in 1947 or 48, he said that the U.S. was going to help free people who were threatened either by people on the inside of their country trying to overthrow the government, or who were threatened by outside forces, right? In essence, if communists were trying to overthrow the government, the United States would help, right? Here, what does Brezhnev say? Well, Brezhnev says basically the opposite thing, right? Is that if somebody's tried to overthrow the communists, he has the right to go in and preserve communism, right? So the United States will go and help you push communism out. The Soviets are going to go back and make sure that communism is not getting pushed out, right? So it's kind of the opposite thing of Truman, right? And so again, this happens in Czechoslovakia. The Alexander Dubček and his like-minded supporters are thrown in jail, and a repressive communist government is put in place. And that's kind of the end of freedom for Czechoslovakia. For now. We'll see Alexander Dubček again in a few years. But we'll get to him later. We also heard about this thing called Solidarity, right? A trade union that gets set up by shipyard workers in Gdansk, Poland. The communists, they go on a strike because they want better hours, better safety regulations, a few other little perks. They go on strike, and the communist government finally says, okay, look, you can form a union and we'll negotiate that way, right? And so after that, the communist government in Poland is pressured to recognize other trade unions as well, which the communist government says, fine, you can set up other trade unions as well. But as we talked about on maybe Thursday, what happens is that these unions kind of start to unite with each other, which is kind of a strange thing. Usually the trade union represents one small group of workers, right? Either at one factory or in one kind of trade, right? So here in BC, for instance, we have the BC Teachers Federation. And that's a trade union of teachers, and they negotiate with the government. Although I'm not really part of that because those are public school teachers that are a part of it. So my fiance is part of that union, but I am not. Yeah, but so usually you just have trade unions for one little specific thing, but here in Poland, they all start to unite together, right? And soon, the communist government of Poland finds that they're not really negotiating with one factory at a time, but suddenly they're negotiating with about 30 or 40% of the workers in Poland, right? And again, you can imagine how much power you have, right? If the government doesn't want to give you what you're asking for, you can say, look, if you don't, on Monday morning, nobody's coming into work. And again, if 40% of the people don't come into work on Monday morning, your country is going to have problems, right? No police, no fire, no bus drivers, no post office. The country will grind to a halt, right? And so Solidarity is going to wind up having a massive amount of power. So much that later we'll see that their leaders are rounded up and thrown in jail because they're too powerful. But don't worry, they'll be back too. Spoiler alert. So this Solidarity thing comes together. Lech Walesa is their kind of leader. He's appointed their leader. He's an electrician, I think, at the Gdansk shipyards, but he winds up being the leader of Solidarity. Okay, and now I have just a little bit more of that documentary to show you, maybe just 10 minutes, just to cover what we've talked about. And so if you are online, again, the video is in Microsoft Teams under Files, and what I'll ask you to watch is the section from, where is it? From 1 hour and 39 minutes and 44 seconds to 1 hour and 51 minutes and 11 seconds. Okay? So I'll ask you to watch that. We'll watch it here, and then we'll come back, okay? All right. Let's just have a look at this. All right. So, I think it might have been on Friday. I think I asked you to read this on Friday, did I not? Did I ask you to read that section? Or to start reading it and then we ran out of time? Does that sound right? Okay. Can I give you just a little more time to look over it again so we can talk about it? Is that okay? Is it not okay? You all hate me, but you just don't want to say it? Huh? No, you don't. Okay. I'll put some time on the clock here. We can look over it one more time and then we'll talk about it, okay? Actually, I'll put some time on the clock, then we'll have a break. Then we'll talk about it. Hey. Okay, hardworking people, you want to take a little break? Little break, you okay? All right. Let's take a break, come back in 10, and we'll deal with this. Yes. So, I asked you to read this section of the textbook. There's not a ton going on here, to be honest. Just a few little things that are important. Let me just, here we go. So, we see here kind of there's kind of a breakup happening here. There's an end of a relationship. And we'll talk about this shortly, but when Mao wins the revolution and declares the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Soviet Union is overjoyed. They're like, yes, another communist country, another person like us, right? And they recognize People's Republic of China. They get cozy with them. They give them money, and they send Soviet scientists to help them develop their technology. And so Communist China and Communist Soviet Union are kind of buddies from about 1949 to into kind of the 1960s. But we'll see that that relationship starts to kind of strain and come apart, right? The Chinese are kind of, or actually I shouldn't say that, because what causes this what causes this relationship to kind of split up between China and the Soviet Union? Why don't they like each other anymore? They were BFFs. Now they're more like frenemies. What's going on here? China and Soviet Union. Anna, do you have one thing?
The Soviets refused to help China to create nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so China wanted nuclear weapons. They knew that the Soviet Union knew how to make them. And so they said, hey pal, hey buddy, help us with our nuclear program. And of course, the Soviet Union had already signed on to those non-proliferation things. And so they said, nope, sorry China, we can't help you. We're not going to, we're not going to help you develop nuclear weapons. Of course, the Chinese will figure it out on their own a little bit later, but they don't get any help from the Soviet Union, and they're kind of, they didn't like that, right? What's another thing that's causing a problem in this relationship? What's another thing? Kenny, do you have another thing?
I'm not sure about this. I don't have time to read it all.
You're not sure about it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about it.
Okay. Who might be more sure about it? What about the superpowers? China's not a superpower, or at least not yet. Regina, what do you think? Oh, there's a border conflict? Yep, the Russians and the Chinese get into a little bit of border disagreements, right, about where the border is between China and the Soviet Union. And so they start to station troops along the border. So that's clear sign that two countries don't trust each other anymore, right? If you look at the American-Canadian border, you'll see that we do not have troops along the border because we trust our neighbor, even though they get a little crazy sometimes. But we still kind of trust them. And so we have troops here on the Soviet border, the Soviet-Chinese border. And there's probably one more thing. The border thing, the nuclear weapons thing, and what's the other problem in the relationship of the Soviet Union and China? Do you have one for me there, Abby? Or Regina?
I think the Chinese ambushed the Soviet army.
That's part of the border dispute, I think, right? There was an ambush. Okay, yeah. Abby?
Was it because you want to talk to the university?
That kind of happens a little later, but yeah, the Chinese start to kind of drift away from the Soviet Union, and they start to connect with the Americans, right? The other thing that's going on here is that Mao, Mao has always seen himself as like one of the leaders of communism, right? So when you think about the big guys of communism, you see Lenin, you see Stalin, And Mao kind of thought he was up there too, right? It was like Lenin and Stalin and Mao, right? The big communist leaders. And so Mao kind of saw himself this way, but the Soviets never really did, right? The Soviets thought he was kind of a so-so communist, right? They didn't really have a lot of respect for him. And so the Soviet Union still saw themselves as kind of the head of worldwide communism, but Mao kind of thought that he should be respected as well. And so the Soviets didn't like what Mao was doing. Mao didn't like what the Soviet Union was doing. And so Mao kind of started to drift away from the Soviet Union and began to kind of connect with the Americans, right? And the Americans could provide loans and money, and they could start to trade with the Americans. And so we saw some of that happening in the film, right? We saw President Richard Nixon was invited to communist China, right? The first US president to set foot in the People's Republic of China. And that was a long time, right? Because 1949, and then Nixon comes in 1972, right? That's 22 years until an American president actually visits communist China, right? But they show up there and they start to kind of connect, right? And why would the Americans make friends with China, do you think?
It's close to Soviet Union.
Yeah, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so before we had this big block of communists, right? We had the Soviet Union and we had China, and they were really close. But now the Chinese have kind of drifted away, and so the Americans are like, come over here, communist China, be our friend instead, right? So they're trying to, isolate the Soviet Union a little bit, break up that big communist bloc, and yeah, maybe they're not super interested in being China's friend, but it's better than being China's enemy, right? So they kind of start to make friends with the Chinese government. Then we get to Helsinki. Anyone know where Helsinki is? It's a city. In what country, though? Where? Nope. I'll give you a hint. Da-dun. If I was a fish?
What is it, a shark or something?
Yeah, it's a shark. But what's the thing on the top of the shark?
Fin.
Yeah. It's in Finland, yes. Wow, right? Helsinki's in Finland, right? So all these countries get together, they sit down and they sign a big agreement. And the agreement has kind of three main parts. What's the first part of this agreement? What do they agree to? First section of Helsinki. This one's kind of a big deal. The second part, not so much. The third part's a big deal, but the first one's a big deal too.
So they're basically like abandoning Soviet Union and become a unit powers to fight against them, because in the book they say they're going to like assume civil rights and guardians like the borders of Europe.
Oh, okay. Well, but let's start with the first part, right? Because you've got two things there. The first part is the questions relating to security in Europe. Yeah, so what was the first part about? What does it say here? It gave the Soviet Union and its allies what they've been seeking on border issues in Europe. So basically what's happening here is that those borders in Eastern Europe are being recognized as official, right? They were unofficial, right? Because remember at the end of the Second World War, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, they couldn't really agree on anything, right? And so they kind of left a lot of things unresolved, right? They didn't really agree on things, and so things just kind of stayed the way they were. right? But here, the Soviet Union gets the West to say, okay, those borders in the West are permanent, and they are not to be changed, and they're not to be violated, right? So you can't just roll over the border of Hungary or Romania or East Germany whenever you want, right? So the Soviet Union wanted those borders officially recognized by the West, and they get that, right? They get what they want. Yes, right? Number two, what's the second part of this agreement?
Cooperation in the field of economics and science and technology
Yeah.
and environment.
Yeah, so these two powers sort of recognize that they should cooperate in terms of economics and science and things like that. I don't know that anything really comes out of that second part, but it's nice that they recognize they need to cooperate, right? But what's the third part? The third part is important. Is what? Yeah, it has to do with the recognition of human rights, right? And so, as you have probably guessed from our history of the Soviet Union so far, the Soviet Union and communist countries tend to not be great at respecting people's human rights, right? And in part, that's because the state always comes first, right? In a democracy, individual rights come first. The rule of law comes first. In a communist state, or at least in communist states of this period, the state comes first, the party comes first, and people's rights and freedoms come after that. And so they all sign on here recognizing the importance of human rights, universal human rights. And at the time, of course, the Soviets don't think it's a big deal, right? I think the foreign secretary of the Soviet Union says to Leonid Brezhnev, he's like, don't worry, it's just a piece of paper, right? It's nothing. That's what they said in the documentary. But US President Gerald Ford, he's like, this is the time bomb, right? Because now the Soviet Union has admitted that human rights exist, and the Soviet Union has said that human rights should be respected, right? Now that the Soviet Union has actually said that, it's going to cause people to stand up and actually push for those human rights, right? And so we see that in Czechoslovakia. They actually write out a declaration, right? This is what the Czechoslovakian government needs to do to respect human rights. Of course, the communist government in Czechoslovakia doesn't really like that, and they throw all those guys in jail. But still, you can see that they're going to start holding the Soviet Union accountable for some of those things, right? So the Soviet Union gets something they want out of Helsinki. They get their borders guaranteed. But the Americans get something too, right? An admission from the Soviet Union that human rights matter, right? They're important. And again, people are going to stand up and start to demand that the Soviet Union respect those rights. And again, the Czechs are the first people to try that, but it doesn't go well. They get thrown in jail. But don't worry, they'll be back. Just like, what's his name? Just like Alexander Dubček, he'll be back. So don't worry about Václav Havel, he'll be back too. Aha! And then finally, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Why did they invade Afghanistan? I know this is a big, long, complicated story, but can you maybe summarize it in like 2 sentences for me? I know that's a lot to ask. Why did the Soviets invade Afghanistan? Pardon me, sorry. This cough is just kind of hanging on a little bit.
Because they're worried about the southern side
They're worried about the southern side?
of Russia.
Okay. Give me a little bit more. I think you're right, but what are they worried about specifically? What are the Soviets worried about in Afghanistan? Can I help you out with this one? Good, okay? All right. So this is a complicated situation, right? As you can see, there's a bunch of different factions. There's originally, Afghanistan has a government that is friendly to the Soviet Union, right? But as you can see, there is unrest between, or within Afghanistan, between kind of an urban elite and a rural population, right? There's fighting that goes on. There's an overthrow of the government. There's a lot of kind of internal instability, and the Soviets are worried that they're going to lose their ally, right? They worry that they're going to wind up with a government that is leaning toward the United States, right? And so in response, they decide that they're going to go in, take control of the government, and install someone who they want in there, right? And again, this is kind of a very common thing for the Soviet Union to do, right? They just finished doing it in Czechoslovakia, didn't they? Alexander Dubček wanted all of those, he wanted all of those freedoms. The Red Army rolled in, threw Alexander Dubček in jail, and installed a leader that was friendly to the Soviet Union, right? Job done, then they go home. So they try it here in Afghanistan, but are they going to be successful? No, they are not, right? And we see that they're very successful initially, right? They roll into the capital city of Kabul, they take it, they jail everybody who's not friendly to them, and they install a new government. But why is that not job finished for them? Why is the war not over? Because they take Kabul in like a few days, I think. But why are they going to be stuck there for another 10 years? Because what? Yeah, there's a resistance, right? So, I'm sorry. Part of the problem in Afghanistan, I'm really sorry. Part of the problem in Afghanistan is that the urban elite, right, the people in the cities, have a different priority from the people in the countryside, right? So when the Soviets come in, they take over the government, they take over the city, but Afghanistan is not really very centralized, right, in terms of its power. There's all of these mujahideen, right, these religious leaders out in the countryside, and they're all kind of working independently, right? And so because the Soviets go in and they sort of, cut off the head of the serpent, right? They cut off the head of the government. It doesn't really mean that Afghanistan falls, because Afghanistan is very decentralized, right? Lots of people are independent, they're doing their own thing. And so the Soviets have to conquer the city, but then they actually have to go out to the countryside and conquer every single one of those religious leaders, because they're all operating independently on their own, and they're doing whatever they want, right? They're not following orders from the capital city. And so that's where the Soviets run into problems, because there's so many of these people. All of them are kind of doing their own thing. They're not following orders of anyone. And they're conducting this kind of guerrilla warfare, right? And so they kind of pop out of the mountains, they attack, and then they disappear again, right? And they're not really fighting in a traditional style. They're fighting on their own land, which is always an advantage. The landscape is very difficult to fight in anyway, right? It's very mountainous and rocky, right? It's not very flat, so you can't really see what's going on. And so the Soviets kind of get stuck here, right? They take the capital city, but they can't take the countryside, right? They can't defeat all of these individual religious leaders that are out in the country. And so they kind of get stuck there for 10 years. And after a while, they don't want to leave, because, like, how embarrassing would that be, right? The mighty Soviet Union loses to Afghanistan. Embarrassing, right? So they get in there, and then they can't get out, right? Because it would look bad. And so they continue fighting this war for 10 years. And as you can see, it costs them a lot of money. right? Can you imagine $12 million a day to fight a war that you're not really winning? And like, what is the point of it, right? What is the point of fighting this war? But again, the Soviets kind of get stuck there. And some people have made some comparisons to what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now, right? The Russian army has entered Ukraine, but they can't really make any progress, right? They can't really get anywhere. And sadly, about the same number of Russian soldiers have died, never mind Ukrainians or Afghans. But the war has been incredibly costly to Russia. And again, they're not really getting anywhere. But they don't want to quit either, right? Because that will look very bad for Russia to be defeated by little old Ukraine. Right? So sadly, in some ways, the Russians are kind of stuck in a similar situation. They've started a war that maybe they can't win, but also if they give up and go home, it's going to look really bad. So they're kind of stuck, right? And here, as you can see, the Soviets are burning through a lot of money, right? And this is money that they don't have, right? Because they are in a nuclear arms race with the United States. And look at some of these numbers here. So by the this is about 1980, right? Because the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979. So in 1980, each country has almost 30,000 nuclear weapons, which is unbelievable, right? These weapons are so powerful. Having 30,000 of them is, yeah, you could destroy the entire planet with all of these, right? It is literally insane what's going on. But still, the Soviets and the Americans are dumping money into this program. The problem is that the Americans can actually afford it, whereas the Soviets can't. Now they're stuck in a war in Afghanistan that they can't win, but they also can't lose, because that would look bad. And they're just dumping money into it as well, right? So it's really going to be kind of financially painful for the Soviet Union. As you can see, the Soviet Union here is pretty much equal to the U.S. at this point. Their missile ranges are about the same. They've got about the same number of planes. They've got the same number of missiles, give or take, right? Their armies are actually larger for the Soviet Union, the number of tanks and soldiers and artillery they have. But again, in a nuclear war, none of that means anything, right? Because the nuclear weapons are going to vaporize all of that stuff, right? So again, it's still a very scary time, I think, with all of those weapons in existence, right? And again, both sides are roughly equal at this point, but again, one side has lots and lots of money, and one side really can't afford to do what they're doing. Right? So, what we'll do at this point is we're going to press pause on the Cold War, and I want to spend maybe 2 or 3 days just looking at what happens with China, right? Because China, of course, is an important country in 20th century history, but maybe even a more important country in 21st century history, because they're far more economically and politically and militarily powerful than they were in the 20th century. So they're definitely worth talking about and looking at, okay? So when we come back tomorrow, we'll start to look at China, we'll deal with China's story, and then we'll jump back into the Cold War for kind of the ending of the Cold War and kind of the birth of the Russian Federation. Before I let you go, do you have any questions or concerns or problems or things that you would like to say? Questions you would like to ask? Comments, queries, concerns, criticisms? No? Okay. Then that is all for today. You can pack it up. I'll see you tomorrow.